Welcome to Daanish TV, everyone. This is Azhar Imran, and we're going to have a very special interview today with a very special guest, Kirby. She's a New York-based lawyer and human rights activist, engaged and involved with the organization MADRE, the Spanish word for mother, and actively involved in the work of the Afghan refugees. And she's been visiting Pakistan to talk to the people, the activists, and organization with respect to issues of Afghan refugees. And it's been honored to have her on our show, and we will be interesting to know about her work and her organizational work. Thank you, Kirby.
Well, it's such an honor to be here, Azhar, on your show. And yes, so I'm with MADRE, which is an international feminist fund and human rights organization, and I've just happened to have been lucky enough to have the chance to pass some time in Pakistan, and I've been running into and having conversations with a lot of people, including a lot of Afghan women refugees who were recently made refugees post August 2021. I also actually happened upon a protest encampment in the city of Islamabad, where a lot of Afghan refugees have been living because they have nowhere else to go, and that includes women and families and a lot of other people.
So could you briefly explain about what is your understanding of this crisis, and particularly the situation on ground about women and children, and how this crisis is going to prolong and last, and what could be the best strategies to tackle with respect to?
Yeah. Well, I would say, obviously, all of the women that I spoke to had a lot of condemnation for the human rights violations that are being committed by the Taliban, everything from the denial of access to education, the imprisonment and disappearance and killing of human rights defenders, including women human rights defenders, the complete disruption and elimination of services and justice for gender violence victims and survivors. But I would also say that it's really important to remember that they're also very upset at the hypocrisy of the international community in this circumstance. And I think I've met people and I've heard stories about the issues that they're facing here in Pakistan, and I'll talk about that, but I want to make clear that I think that both the Pakistani government as well as the international community are really complicit in essentially facilitating human rights violations by the Taliban. And the way that happens is that people that have managed to flee here, which is a incredible feat to actually get to Pakistan in the first place, have very, very unstable document situations. So they're having to go and renew their visas and this kind of thing, and facing situations where they're being exploited because of the way that the system is set up, essentially. And so one of those issues is that they're having to, many of them have had to cross back into Afghanistan to get, exit and entry stamps, essentially, in order to be able to come back and stay and be, safer here in Pakistan. And I have heard stories, including one of, just one example of a woman human rights defender who crossed in the spring in order to get her stamps, and she was in touch with another women human rights defender here in Pakistan who has stayed in touch with her, but essentially on the Pakistan side, on the Afghanistan side, the Taliban stopped her and said, why aren't you traveling with a mahram? They physically committed violence against her. They unjustly imprisoned her, and then essentially said, you can't leave, and she's been forced to go back to an abusive family situation. So this is both a women human rights defender and a gender violence survivor who now is stuck, and we understand, the international community understands that when that happens, when a woman or other survivor, an LGBT person or a girl or a boy is stuck with an abusive family and unable to get out, because there's no shelter, no services, that's actually a form of torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And so essentially that process is facilitating torture, and we hold the people responsible for that torture are the people that have control right now of those services, or the denial or access to them, and that's the Taliban. But we also hold accountable the people that are facilitating, essentially people being made to be in that situation. If she didn't have to cross back and forth, this woman would never be in that situation. But I also have to say that the other thing that so many people have been talking to me about is just the complete. It seems like the international community has totally forgotten about Afghan women and Afghan women refugees. And if they actually cared, and I'm talking about countries that have more resources than Pakistan, that spent billions on war, supposedly in the name of defending women's rights, and now are not taking in refugees. They're failing to provide the services that refugees, including women and girls, need in places that are transit countries like Pakistan, and including even in places like Afghanistan, because there are still some services and some women's grassroots organizations that are able to help gender violence victims. It's limited, but they are there. And if the international community was meaningfully in contact with those grassroots women's groups, as they should be, if they care about women, they would be supporting them and supporting all of the groups on the receiving sides, where we know the majority of folks are coming into Pakistan, to make sure that their needs are met and they're not put in a position where they are susceptible to exploitation, and that kind of thing.
And Kirby, as you're a lawyer yourself, so there are 2-3 very pertinent questions to be asked, I think, for our audience to understand the gravity of the Afghan women issues, and particularly the women, and of course generally the refugee issues. One, you've been visiting Pakistan, and you have the idea of the resource scarcity, and the fact that Pakistan has been gone through because of war on terror, with respect to while we have already 2 to 3 million Afghan refugees, though the previous Prime Minister Khan was willing to provide nationalities and citizenship so that they could be integrated into mainstream society and also into economy, but there was an opposition from the nationalist parties and leaders. So how do you see the Pakistan's the issue of resources with respect to that, and if the international community is more serious and give more resources to Pakistan and put some pressure so that we could take up this issue seriously, because we are having already almost 3 million refugees in Pakistan since the first Afghan war. And the second, what is the role of the Human Rights Refugee Commission, HRC, the UNO Commission on Refugees, what role they can play in terms of, and what is the legal cover with respect to that, not only against Taliban but also the states where the refugees are coming, with respect to that, what is the international refugee law's position on that with respect to their rights, and what could be done with this domain to protect their rights?
Well, I would say that's such a great series of questions, and I would say that Pakistan should sign and ratify and abide by the Refugee Convention for sure. I feel like actually all countries should do that, and that the international community has a responsibility to step up, and especially given what happened over the last 20 years, given the destruction to Afghan civilians, the bombing.
You mean the war on terror thing, the destruction that has happened under war on terror with respect to that?
Yeah, I mean, we know that there were a lot of civilians killed as a result of U.S. militarism, and I think that there's a responsibility that countries like the U.S. and the U.K. and other countries have to actually do something to, at this point, to respond to the crisis that they've helped create. And so again, like everyone should be respecting the Refugee Convention. People should be given the right, that they should have the right to access asylum, to seek asylum, and I think that part of what has to happen is that the international community needs to step up by accepting Afghan refugees, by also putting some pressure on the Pakistani government to ensure that the paperwork requirements that they're putting on Afghan refugees are not such a burden that they can't leave the country, that they can't, that they're put at risk, but they also absolutely need to be accepting more refugees.
Okay, so because your organization is based in New York, so looking at your work and your organizational experience, what is actually the understanding of the civil society and the Western elites, of course, particularly in the U.S., with respect to crisis of the refugees? Are they serious about it? And what could be done actually to create more pressure, the organization like yours who's working in New York, so that they can actually talk to the regional states like Pakistan who are actually dealing with that, and also to ensure the rehabilitation and security of the refugees?
I mean, there's a number of things. I think that in terms of U.S. civil society, there needs to be in terms of what they're actually seeing. I think it depends on the media that they're looking at, and so to some extent, the mainstream media has been kind of overtaken by the war in Ukraine. And so there's not the focus that there should be on the continued and worsening crisis for Afghan refugees. So, I mean, in an ideal world, the media would cover that crisis fairly and actually get, U.S. civil society to feel the same anger that many people actually felt. I walking around my neighborhood, there were just casual conversations when people witnessed the video of people, the airlift that was leaving from the airport in
Kabul, back when
Kabul.
the Afghan withdrawal was finalizing.
Yeah, and people were horrified at seeing what happened in that instance, and that I think that was also the first time in a while that that kind of killing and violence against Afghan people was being covered in a meaningful way, because a lot of the media was in Kabul for that moment and able to access these scenes. But so people, I think that there is a sense in the United States amongst at least some folks that what is happening and what has happened to Afghan people is totally unacceptable. And I think though that requires us on the left, broadly, or just in peace movements, to get meaningfully organized and get people to pull the levers of power. Everyone needs to be, I think, calling representatives and marching on government officials' headquarters, the Congress, to demand that there actually be support for Afghan refugees and a meaningful support for Afghan women in general, which to me doesn't mean, no one that I've talked to here has said, please come and bomb our country again. No one is saying we want to starve, and
Exactly.
No one wants any of that. What they want is for Afghan women and civil society more broadly, but especially Afghan women, to have a meaningful place in the decision making about their lives that's happening. So at the international level, Afghan women need to have a seat at the table because they've been denied that for a long time, and they need to have a seat at the table in determining the strategies for diplomatic and other forms of pressure to create positive social change, to put pressure on the Taliban, and to ensure that they can finally have recognition of their human rights.
Okay, so before we conclude all this very interesting conversation, I can go long, but before we conclude, one very pertinent question, because I have seen that Afghan diaspora is very active on social media. So how do you see the role of Afghan diaspora, particularly in U.S. but overall in Europe, with respect to highlighting the issues of the Afghan refugees, and particularly the plight of Afghan women and children, so that their human rights could be protected? And are you people working and trying to get organized with those Afghan diaspora?
Well, mostly I've met a lot of folks in the diaspora here in Pakistan, and I agree that the diaspora has a really important role to play in educating people, and that I know that so many were in and have been for decades at this point, including in the U.S. There were, and globally, there were all these efforts post August 2021 to try and help people who needed to flee and to get to safety. And it was maddening because you had, people that are just volunteers and NGOs who have, like MADRE, that have some capacity, but not as much as governments, who were trying to meet the needs and trying to set up rescue systems, and are still doing that. And right now what we really need is for the governments that have the resources to step up and provide them. I think that the diaspora, from what I can see, is pushing, and they're doing what they can, but if it's not matched by action from donor states, essentially, there's only so much that they can do.
Well, Kirby, I think a couple of things that we need to keep in mind with respect to the role of Pakistan in all this crisis. Two things that I want to point out. One, you talk about this is a huge bureaucratization with respect to documentation process of the Afghan refugees, which is true, but it has also do a lot of pressure coming on Pakistan from not only US and the Western European states, but also the regional states, because of this fear that some of these Afghan refugees are Taliban sympathizer, and they actually could go back and involved in the terrorist activities. That actually has pushed Pakistan a huge pressure to go for documentation process. And of course, there are some internal elements are also involved. So, and the most important thing is that Pakistan could not do much about with respect to documentation process, as well as the rehabilitation process, the way the Western government have responded with respect to funding Pakistan for Afghan refugees, and looking at the role of the Biden administration, the way they first freeze the Afghan finance reserves in the US banks, but then also when put under pressure by international governments and the human rights organization, declaring that the half of the money will go to the the victim of 9/11. So these are also perspectives that we need to keep in mind. So how do you see this? Because Pakistan have been unfairly accused, I think, with respect to Afghan refugees, because one, since 1980s, the first Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Afghan jihad, Pakistan has been managing 2 to 3 million Afghan refugees, and also in last 4 or 5 years, due to indigenous military operation, again under the pressure of the US government, we had to face, like in northern areas of Pakistan, Fata and the belt associated to the Afghan border, almost 500,000 to 1 million internal refugees, and that also created a huge crisis. And I think in that respect, even the indigenous Pakistani refugees had to go through the same documentation process, and there were a lot of reports in the media that these bureaucratic documentation process are actually causing humiliation and problem for these internal refugees. So how do you see this? Because I think this perspective is very important to keep in mind, because normally Pakistan has been treated unfairly, the way the geopolitics plays out with respect to accusation leveled against violation of human rights, and then of course associated with the violation of the refugees of Afghan. So in this context, I think there is also another important point to be made with respect to this oversimplification of the Western media, and also the NGOs with respect to Pakistan having influence and control over Taliban. So Pakistan can actually use its power to lessen the refugee crisis issues. So it may be true back in the 90s that Pakistan had clout and power over Taliban, but in the contemporary context, when the way Taliban had resisted for almost 2 decades of Afghan war and terror, to simply call it out that Pakistan could actually control everything about Taliban, and it could be, internal politics of Taliban in Afghanistan, as the Ashraf Ghani accuses, but also with respect to the refugees and the, documentation, by facilitating the documentation process, by putting pressure on the Taliban. I think it's a bit unrealistic and demanding too much from Pakistan. So how do you see this?
Well, I really appreciate all that perspective, including some of the history and the, as well as actually that point that you made about this terrible decision on the part of Biden to basically steal money from Afghanistan at a point where people are deeply impoverished and starving. And I would say that I think that you're right. The international community, wealthier countries, have a major responsibility and need to step up and play a role in ensuring that there are resources to meet the refugee need at this point, and that it shouldn't be totally, the weight should not be fully on Pakistan. I mean, I do think in the immediate for some immediate relief of the danger that people face when they're forced to go back, that were those restrictions lifted by Pakistan, that would provide some immediate protection, so that they didn't have to go back into the hands of the Taliban. But I see that not just as the fault of Pakistan. I see that as the fault of the other governments as well, who refuse to take Afghan refugees, because by doing that, by leaving them in limbo, by refusing to support them, essentially, and people can provide, can push for Pakistan to lift these particular visa renewal requirements, but that should be followed up with major economic support to actually help meet the needs of refugees that are coming, as well as an opening of their doors. They need to be taking refugees themselves. So I think you're right in the sense of, the pressure that's been put on Pakistan, accompanied with years of support essentially for militarization in Pakistan, which hasn't actually been helpful to people here. So I appreciate all of those points.
And I think what the points you have made, I would like to also add one of the very important pertinent points that former Prime Minister Imran Khan kept speaking about again and again, and it not only the local Pakistani pro-Western media and NGOs, but also the Western governments, and one of the reasons that the President Biden did not got in contact with the Imran Khan, because he kept talking about that that we need to be concerned about once the withdrawal is completed, the fallout would be in the form of the Afghan refugee crisis, and Pakistan would be the first victim. And given our own precarious situation in the FATA region and the region associated with the Afghan border and the military operation going on in Pakistan, that would be very difficult for Pakistan to manage without the Western governments, and particularly the major role to be played by the USA. And the Biden administration did not even talk to Khan with respect to that. And even if they talked to occasionally, they were more interested in for military role, taking military bases, and airspace, so that they can keep attacking Afghanistan. That will further, make the situation worsen for the Afghan refugees, and would add more Afghan refugees to Pakistan. So there's this side of debate with respect to Afghan refugees that we need to keep in mind. And also one of the key points that I think was unprecedented, at least any Pakistani leader so deeply concerned about the Afghan refugees, as the Khan spoke not only the Western government and the role of the Western government in overcoming the crisis of Afghan refugees, but also at the latest OIC summit, the Foreign Minister OIC summit that took place just weeks before he was ousted, that he actually pledged the Muslim governments to come up with economic and other plans, and particularly the financial support for Afghan refugees, not only inside Pakistan but also all over the Muslim world and also in Afghanistan. And I think in that way, when Pakistan is also going through an economic crisis, Pakistan's responsibility with respect to economic crisis and financial management support of Afghan refugees compromises its capability when we have so much, internal economic issues. And that's the role that Pakistan, in particular former Prime Minister Imran Khan, spoke about, was mainly to both the regional states, the Muslim world, and to the international community. But unfortunately, due to their own geopolitics, no one paid attention to that. And that is what we are seeing now, a very, very painful crisis of Afghan refugees in Pakistan, but also in Afghanistan and in the region.
Yeah, those are all really great points.
Thank you very much, Kirby. It's a pleasure talking to you. I think for our audience, both here in Pakistan and abroad, it would be very, interesting, information to understand the crisis that has unfolded with respect to women, and particularly the Afghan refugees, after the U.S. withdrawal and Afghan, takeover. And this is the issue that need to be debated both locally and in international media to ensure the human rights of the Afghan refugees. For that, thank you very much, and goodbye from the Daanish TV.